So this is session one of organization development, and in today's session we're going to look at an introduction to OD and a discussion on planned change. So just a brief introduction to myself. My background is operations management in Bournemouth, the Irish Peat Development Authority, where I got expertise in self-managing teams, and that got me interested in organizational behavior and organization development. I moved to the Irish Management Institute, the National Management Centre. I became head of management development there, and I spent quite a while introducing people to the skills of management, developing managers. And after a considerable amount of time there, I moved to academia, the School of Business at Maynooth University, where I became for a short time head of the school, and subsequently moved to the School of Business in Trinity College in Dublin as an adjunct professor of management. I'm now co-founder of Donovan Learning, a company aimed at developing managers. So let's get on with our session today on organization development. You have an assessment. Your in-class presentation, as you know, is 20%. Your individual essay is 80%, due on the 30th of November. The scheme of the individual essay is to compare and contrast organization design and organization development. Compare and contrast is what's similar and what's different. Compare is what's similar. Contrast is what is different between the two concepts. Your task is also to create a metaphor or an analogy that one might use to illustrate and explain the similarities and the differences between these two concepts. Subsequently, draw on your own experience to consider ways that these approaches might change in the post-pandemic world. We'll put a note on Blackboard to indicate that 50% of the group will submit to John and 50% of the group will submit to Paul a 200-word email describing how they're going to tackle this individual essay. So the purpose of that is to try and steer you correctly so that you don't go off on the wrong tack in this assignment. The three parts to this section of your module is introduction to OD and plan change. Today, the second session is going to be about organizational learning. The third one is going to be about organizational culture. You've been familiar with models that John has introduced you to, and he's talked about organization design, which is really the environment, and the environment, how the environment affects and how the organization interacts with and is changed by the environment. And the 7S framework taught us that structure is not organization. A structure doesn't mean an organization, because there are other things like strategy, system, style, shared values, skills, and staff. So all these models that John has shared with you are to enable you to see how we live within a system in an organization, a wider system. Galbraith's STAR model is quite similar, looks at similar concepts to the one that Waterman's 7S framework looks at. The business ecosystem shows that we are nested in our organization, we are nested within other systems, and simple changes in any one system can have considerable effects on the goings on in other systems. The Fresher McKinsey model, which is a replacement almost for the 7S framework, is quite similar in lots of ways, and you'll find that with models in management, that they're often quite a reheat or a microwave of previous versions. However, these ones do add to our knowledge about the fact that the organization sits within a nest of systems and is affected by them and interacts with them. One of the things we have to be aware of is what management is. So management is the kind of agent or agencies within an organization that affect quite a lot of the change. So if the environment impacts us, managers usually interpret the environment and make changes to cope with what's going on in the environment, to find a niche, a defendable niche that we can execute a strategy from. So what's management? Management is getting results through other people, getting things done through other people, developed by Mary Parker Follett over 100 years ago. And it's a very subtle, profound definition, because it denotes the two things that managers have got to get the alchemy or the chemistry right about in organizations. The results, the task on the one hand, and the people on the other hand. So you'll hear the word sociotech mentioned in organization development, and sociotech is one of those. It's one of those puzzles or challenges that face all organizations. How do you get the technology of the organization and the humans in the organization in a kind of a symbiosis, in a kind of a joint fusion in a way, so that you get the maximum benefit from both. So we showed an excerpt from a newspaper in the United States, shown by it was published with respect to Ford, what Ford was doing in Detroit in early February 1914. Ford made an offer in a response to his environment of $5 a day for workers. Now, this is significant. $5 a day was an incredible amount of money. It was double what people were earning in other places, other factories. And what Ford wanted to achieve was command over workers. He wanted to gather the best workers, and he wanted to strap them into systems, his systems, so that he could control them ultimately. And he wanted workers that would attend, he wanted workers that would commit, and he wanted workers who wouldn't have any absenteeism. It seems today we're doing the same thing. Amazon looks for new hires and agrees to pay them $18 an hour, at the same time as McDonald's workers are getting $15 an hour. So it's quite an attractive thing for minimum wage workers to join a company. Now, of course, you pay a price for joining companies like Ford at the time and like Amazon. They're not doing it for the good of their health. They're doing it to strap in these individuals into a system which demands the individual commits and engages with the organization, of course. Now, if you look at the conveyor system of the Ford factories and other factories which copied this successful, for a while anyway, successful system, the conveyor belt system can often be boring. In fact, it led to anger and frustration with lots of workers, especially maybe intelligent workers, higher quality workers that were drawn in to work there by the great salaries, but found that they were fed up not long after they joined. And the spread of this kind of system of working, highly specialized workers, workers who could do a simple task that was easily trained into a worker, and workers could be replaced quite quickly. So the system was durable and robust. So it didn't need craft people. In fact, this is an antidote to craft workers who had autonomy and who have skills, and they're not really that replaceable. And that was a nonsense to Ford, who wanted to churn out lots of motor cars cheaply. And Ford achieved two things. One, got lots of motor cars produced cheaply, but also paid workers enough that they could afford to buy the cars. So creating a middle class almost in America, because lots of other factories copied what he was doing. But take it forward 50, 60 years, you found that the Swedish car makers were trying to redesign work so that the socio-tech bit was more harmonious. So you had team working around the construction of cars, requiring an awful lot more engagement and commitment. Would that suit the individual American worker? Well, sometimes it was tried, what didn't work too well. Probably fitted in with a Scandinavian type of community approach to living. So it goes to show you that that the system can be adjusted to make the jobs much more harmonious for individuals and much more satisfying for individuals. But you can't, well, it's difficult to lift up a successful approach in one national culture and drop it into another national culture and hope that it's going to work. That needs more thought. So also at the time, as an antidote to high specialization and soulless jobs, Douglas McGregor developed a theory of theory X and theory Y, theories of management. In other words, that your management approach in organizations depended quite a lot on the kind of philosophy that you had. And McGregor describes theory X as being very Fordist in its approach, that workers needed to be bribed or beaten, bribed or punished to get into work, because they would avoid responsibility, they had to be controlled, they lacked responsibility and stuff like that. The theory Y approach, complete opposite. Different way of looking at workers. You could leave them alone, you could set goals with them, and they would seek responsibility. They could actually make good decisions if they were left alone. So they are amenable to self-direction. And these two different philosophies, they produce very different kinds of management approaches and styles. So, along with this antidote to the Fordist type style, investigations showed that there was a lot going on in workplaces. For example, a very famous study, the Hawthorne plant studies, when Elton Mayo and his colleagues were actually studying the effect of changes of environment on workers. So they found that when they increased the lighting in the plant, productivity went up. And then they tried decreasing the lighting, and counterintuitive finding was that the productivity went up. Shouldn't have, according to your intuition. And they discovered that what was really happening is that the actual changes themselves they almost they drew attention. The effects of the changes drew attention to the workers. The workers were actually able to draw attention to themselves by their actions, and they were also it was probably an early time, a first time that a lot of these workers had received such significant attention or maybe respect, and this had effect on their performance. So there's always this notion about when work is studied, does it actually change how people perform? That when you research something, you have to be careful that you don't interfere with what's going on, so that what you're looking at is not objective in the sense you're actually part of the experiment in a way. But it did encourage people, and it did add to people's knowledge about behavioral science in organizations. Now, the stems of OD from these historical situations. So you have, back in the old days, the craftspeople had lots of power, but industrialists came along and wrested the power away from those craft people into the factory type situations where the owners and capital had control over what was done and how it was done, and production went off the charts. But it led to problems in the workplace, it led to sabotage. And you got things like laboratory training was an antidote to bad management practices, to make managers more sensitive to where they how they were coming across. And then other theories like action research, survey feedback, these were attempts to study what's going on in organizations and to feed back to organizations what's actually happening. Normative approaches are part of OD in the sense that OD had a belief that participatory and democratic approaches were the approaches that should be used by management. And normative approaches emerged in the middle of the last century. Quality of work-life initiatives came out, suggesting that improvements in quality of work-life would actually be very beneficial to organizations' effectiveness. And strategic change suggests that OD can offer, by understanding the symmetry and the consistency and the harmony between the different elements of an organization, that OD can actually contribute in that sense by diagnosing the symmetry and the consistency and the harmony between various elements of an organization and its strategy, and can make that whole thing move more effortlessly and more effectively. Various definitions of OD, probably best way to leave these is we go through one of them and maybe just leave the rest of them on the slides, and you can stop and look at them as you wish to go through. But the definitions of OD are quite similar. You'll see all these definitions in the first chapter of the text. But basically, it's a process of planned change, a change through the organization's culture using behavioral science, technology, research, and theory. So basically, is it management change? Well, change is not about, often management change is not about improving the organization. It's about getting a project done. And where OD differs, although it's about planned change, it is about developing the organization so that it improves itself. Like it's a change in the organization's culture. It improves itself. OD leaves a set of improvements where the organization is skilled enough to actually revisit and improve itself in the future. So it's not like a consultant that actually comes in, does a report, gives a solution, and then goes away. But the organization is not more skilled than it was, or not more developed than it was. OD is quite different to that. So here are the other different definitions. You can pause the tape to read them, but they all have a certain similarity of this one in French's definition adds the element of the external or internal behavioral science consultants. Beckhart's definition, again, also includes using behavioral science knowledge. Adds a bit there about manage from the top. This isn't always assumed by OG definitions. Beer's definition is quite comprehensive, but it emphasizes the congruence between the different aspects of an organization. It emphasizes new solutions, and it emphasizes self-renewing capacity, which is an important part of OG, that a skill, a competence is left in the organization after the departure of the consultant. So quite a lot of similarities, but certain distinctions between OG and what one might call normal management change. OG is heavy into diagnosis, so it looks at an organization as an open systems situation. It's got inputs, it's got design components, and it's got outputs. Inputs usually come from the general environment that John was talking to you about in the first half of the module. Outputs are what you might expect in terms of organizational effectiveness, your performance, etc. The bit in the middle are your design components. And this is where most OD concentrates. It concentrates on the harmony and the symmetry between structure, technology, HR, management processes, and culture. And when those things are in harmony, obviously you don't need OD interventions, but it's when the organization becomes aware of a problem, then a diagnostic is required. So the design components that were in that model are things like your strategy. So that's really what business are we in and how are we in it, what stance have we got. Your technology is how you convert your inputs into outputs. Your structure is the way John talked to you about the different types of structure in organizations, how you divide up sections and individuals in the organization, and how you get them to communicate with each other really is what structure is. HR systems, right people, right place, right time, and the right number. And culture is really the set of assumptions that everybody shares, and it accrues over a period of years as a kind of an indication of the way we do things around here. Often basic assumptions in the sense that they're not challenged. Now, this section is also about the nature of planned change, and we first discussed Lewin's planned change. Lewin is one of the heroes of organization development, a prolific theorist. One of his most famous approaches to change was the unfreeze, change, and refreeze. And he likened organizational change to how you might change the shape of an ice cube. If you wanted to change the shape of an ice cube, what you would do is you'd first unfreeze the ice cube until it became water liquid. You would then move it into a different shape. You would pour it maybe into a different mold, and then you would refreeze it in that new shape. So in other words, you would have started maybe with a cube, and you'd end up with a pyramid or cone or something like that. Now, the unfreeze means really, from Lewin's perspective, is to let go of the present and the past. That's one of the things in change is not so much to plan the future. That's not difficult. The difficult part in change is getting people to let go of the present and the past. Really, really difficult. And if you've ever tried to get fit, you know it's easy to buy the gym membership and the tracksuit and the trainers, but getting your backside out the door on a cold November afternoon. That's the hard. Regularly, getting you to do that regularly. So it's letting go of that couch potato idea of yourself. Um, Letting go of that. Letting go of the lifestyle that got you unfit in the first place. So Lewin's plan change is a very interesting one. Action research mentioned in the stems of OD in a couple of slides back is really about no action without research, no research without action. So you take a look, you do some research in the organization, and then you take some action based on that research, and then you actually you repeat the cycle, rinse and repeat, basically. So it's one of the old stables of OD, that kind of process. No action without research, no research without action. The positive model is really about instead of being problem focused in terms of change, why don't we improve the organization by focusing on the things that are working really well, best practices, and then disseminate those best practices around the organization. One of the advantages of this is that you never actually have to fight the culture. If all you're doing is spreading practices that are already successful in the organization, they're never countercultural. They never, if you try and introduce something, a new change, which is countercultural, the culture fights it and eventually gets rid of it. Whereas if you're just transferring best practices around the place, it usually happens much more smoothly and without conflict. The appreciative inquiry model is very much the same. It's about finding things, discovering things that actually work well, and making those things transfer to the rest of the organization. Plan change models have kind of similarities and differences. The similarities can often be things like there's a role of a consultant, there's behavioral science technology in OD, and the differences can often be whether or not the consultant is central, which is often something like unfreeze, move, and refreeze, or whether the consultant is like at the edge, which is in the case of like the appreciative inquiry model or the positive model. And the other thing is whether the plan change model is based on problem solving or social constructionism. So the appreciative inquiry one approach is really based on that people construct their own learning and they construct their own future. And the other thing about it is that change is often more authentic when it's led by the individuals who have to actually work in the organization. When a problem-focused approach often looks at an organization through the lens of management, through the lens of a consultant, and sees a problem as being something to fix. Whereas a good diagnosis often tells you that the causes of the problem can often be deep, underlying, and the gathering of data about that problem can often be problematic in the sense that how do you know it's valid data? But fixing problems without fixing the deep underlying causes can actually lead to further problems. So a general model of plan change has something like a consultant entering the organization, making a contract, diagnosing what's going on, planning and implementing the change, and evaluating and institutionalizing the change. Institutionalizing the change is a bit like Lewin's refreezing. When the change is over, you try and make it permanent in the organization by putting in reward systems that actually do make it permanent. So some types of plan change are incremental and quantum in the sense that you could have some types of plan change are small change. We never really talk about change in terms of small change. Incremental change is like something that is part of the management's work, I think. Quantum change is where you're transforming the organization. Your A transformation is something like IBM from a business machines organization to a software as service organization. And then different types of plan change can actually depend on the degree of organization. So, for example, highly organized change or under-organized change. And then the other thing about different types of plan change, plan change is less complicated when it's domestic, but it can actually be much more complicated when you're working in a cross-cultural situation. Critiques of plan change, well, change isn't linear. The moment you start to address something, you begin to change it. And change is a very dynamic thing. It doesn't fit into often a rational, linear, logical situation, because the moment you try to change in a way is like putting a diaper on a baby. You put the baby down on the bed and you start to change the diaper. But after a baby's a few months old, it starts to learn it can wriggle, and the baby begins to move. And it's a little bit like that when you're actually trying to change organizations. You're trying to pin something on a moving target. The other thing is, it's very hard to evaluate whether or not the change was successful. You may end up getting your targets, but you may not necessarily be able to demonstrate that the organization is better off. So the other question here is in relation to the practice of plan change. There often is limited consulting skills. So there are few enough people in the world who can actually manage change in a very successful way. One of the diseases of change is that we actually have a quick fix approach to change. Often we try to get it done, wham bam, thank you ma'am, but we don't use developmental approaches. If we're trying to change, let's make sure the place is more skilled, better off, and that's something that OD tries to leave the organization more competent than it found it. So the workshop that we looked at was the case of Bord na Móna, and I think we concluded that the Lewin model of change was fully implemented in the case study. And you could see that from the structure taken. In fact, from the history of this case study, the Lewin model was actually used to design the actual change. So often, like things like small examples, like workshops were used with the whole organization in meetings, discussing how we were. Well, it's just discussing things about change. Should people be happy in their work? That was something that workers were never asked in that company. And are happy workers productive workers, or are productive workers happy workers? So it's kind of a lot of interesting discussions, but it was rather unsettling for workers in a way, unsettling in a good way, to discuss these issues and to realize that there are many other ways of actually managing an organization. It was an example of planned change. It was rational. It was quite linear. It had a beginning, middle, and an end. It certainly had its messy elements, but it was highly controlled in terms of what was going to happen to workers who wouldn't be staying with the company. It was highly controlled in relation to the environment. So management spent a lot of time talking to the shareholders and stakeholders to convince them of the need for the change and transformation. And are there downsides to staff involved in this major change initiative? And I would say that one of the downsides may have been that redundancy, even though it's a good check and putting people out onto pension with a good check in their late 50s sometimes isn't the best idea for people who don't have alternatives and for whom the work is the main aspect of their life. So I think that's an ethical problem for management. So a thing worth looking at in the slides is an alternative version of Lewin's model. And I was saying earlier that one of the things about management models is they get repeated through the ages in different shapes, but there's an awful lot of similarity between them. So Lewin's model was repeated by two researchers, one called Noel Tichy and Mary Ann Devanna from Michigan University. And they developed a model looking at the environment as being the global playing field. They describe change as being a three-act drama. The Act 1 was recognizing the need for revitalization in the organization. Act 2 was creating the new vision, and Act 3 was institutionalizing change. Now, the interesting thing about that is, if you look at it quickly, it looks rather similar to Lewin's unfreeze, move, and refreeze. So the first phase is unfreezing is Act 1, recognizing the need for a revitalization. Act 2 is the changing, it's creating a new vision. And Act 3 is the refreezing, it's institutionalizing change. So this became quite an interesting theory, concept developed by Tichy and Devanna about how to transform organizations. And each act had a specific set of things for the individuals and for the organization. Things that were actually necessary, things like increasing motivation to change, getting people to disengage from the past, getting people to disidentify with the past. In creating the vision, it was really creating with people, working with people to create a new vision and to move people towards that vision. And these things can't be done by management diktat. They have to be done in a participatory way, through actions, through participation and collaboration. And the reinstitutionalization or the institutionalization of change is probably one of the most important things, because only by institutionalizing the change can you really truly change the culture. In other words, you change the scripts, you change the way people actually talk, you change the way people actually move, you change what gets rewarded, and you end up with a new culture, a changed culture in the organization. So that's a look at session 1, the introduction to OD and an introduction to planned change in organizations.